Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. We have an author, a very, very well-renowned author, Judy Bebelaar, who's going to highlight one of her many, many works, a book that came out in 2018 called "And Then They Were Gone: Teenagers of People's Temple from High School to Jonestown." I have a copy. I'm very happy. I've been reading it. It's tearing me apart to go through it. It's a very difficult book. What is it about? Well, it's about Jonestown and the people that died there. 918 people died in a mass suicide. And I think for most of us, we've forgotten about it. It's something that happened a long time ago, 1978, but we should not forget for many reasons, which we'll cover today with the author. So Judy, I just don't want to go through all your books. Saw a list and I thought, oh my God. But this particular book, and you wrote it also with Ron Cabral, and Ron unfortunately could not join us. But we're going to talk specifically about this book because I don't know where to begin. Why did you write this book?
Ron and I met the kids from People's Temple in 1976 when Jim Jones, who was the minister of People's Temple, sent almost all the teenagers in the temple, somewhere between 80 and 100. We don't know for sure because the school district wouldn't release the records of the kids from the temple. But when Ron and I looked through a list on a wonderful website sponsored by San Diego State University, it's called Alternative Consideration of Jonestown and People's Temple. And it just has a wealth of information, stories of survivors and photos and facts and research and academic papers, the writings of Stephen Jones, Jim Jones' only son, along with reflections by other people about Jonestown. And if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend that you look up Alternative Considerations of Jonestown and People's Temple.
But you wanted to highlight for the audience, how did you come in contact with these students?
So when Jim Jones sent all those teenagers in 1976 to our little school, there were only 300 kids in this public alternative secondary school. That's when we got to know them. And at first, we were not so pleased with their coming. This was before we knew them, because we had a method for taking kids in. Our school was designed by a group of teachers, including me, to help kids who weren't doing well in school, who didn't like school, who were being truant a lot, who had lots of problems at home. And our school was a chance for them to graduate if they followed our rules and did what we asked of them. There was still a possibility to graduate. Well, we interviewed them one at a time. That was part of our protocol. So 2 teachers and a student maybe would talk to a student for a half an hour or more about the school, about their lives, about what they could do to graduate. And here's what they had to sign on to. But it was going to be a lot of fun too, because we were going on field trips. And I taught cooking with another teacher. We made a whole meal and sat down and ate it. Kids loved that class. I taught poetry because that always pulled kids in. And Jim Jones was just going to send them all in one swoop, or maybe 3 or 4 swoops, large groups at a time. And we wanted to get to know each one. So we were at first against it, but then they came. Our principal was a great admirer of Jim Jones and said, of course you can send them. And we liked them, and they added some spice to our classes because they always spoke up and They were intelligent, well-read, liked school, did all their homework, unlike some of our other students. So we didn't mind so much after all, and just tried to get to know them as best we could. But in the spring of 1977, Jones started sending them off to Jonestown, which at the time we thought was a church mission in Guyana. And the kids, from some of the poems that they wrote in my class, I know, thought it was a jungle paradise and an exciting adventure that they were going to go on, because Jones had told them that they were going to help build a whole community, the gardens, the houses, everything, and create a model society for the whole world to look at, to see how people could live without racism, ageism, or sexism. And
Now,
go ahead.
these were children. Some of them, from what I read, they were wards of the temple. Some had parents. Were they all just following the same fiddle?
No, people often think, as the people who went to Jonestown, adults, and they think mostly adults, people don't realize that a third of those in Jonestown were really children under 18, and a half of them were in their 20s or younger. The older people, a lot of them were what you might call the salt of the earth. They had followed Jim Jones from Indianapolis, where he'd established the first integrated church. And the people that joined, black and white, were people that in a pretty racist society they lived in there really believed in integration and the dignity of all human beings. So they liked Jones for some good reasons. And the church itself did good works, which also the people in the church liked and did willingly and worked hard and, just would do anything to try to be what he described to them as being a true Christian, where you give to other human beings. And he also had them sign over their houses, sign over their social security checks, which they thought was all for the common good, that's how the old Christians lived. And they were going to do the same and share everything. Of course, Jones, he didn't act like a rich person at all. He wore pretty much the same clothes. He didn't, he didn't spend the money on himself, but he didn't use it when he should have to feed his people either. And once they got to Jonestown, of course, they had nothing. The first thing that happened was that their passports were taken away from them. So they were pretty much both imprisoned. There was a huge jungle around them. There was a 24-hour trip across the Atlantic Ocean to get back to Georgetown, where you would be able to leave from. No way of getting there. They were really trapped. And on top of that, he had them terrified, exhausted, and hopeless, because he had convinced them that, one, they'd never get through the jungle if they tried to run away. Either poisonous plants, dangerous animals, or the Guyanese army would get them. The Guyanese army didn't hate them. The Guyanese army wasn't out to get them, but he was a good purveyor of fake news. And on top of that, they didn't have their passport. They didn't have any, you couldn't go to a store and buy food. You only got what Jim Jones gave you, which, as conditions got more and more crowded there, because he sent people in a big rush after bad news came out about him in a magazine called The New West, and then in the San Francisco Chronicle. And he got afraid that he'd be caught. So he sent lots and lots of people there, too many at one time. He was going back and forth. Then finally he stayed there. He took some of his sons who were at the school. He had one biological son, Stephen, and then 4 other adoptive sons, and 3 of them went to our school. He took those, Stephen going first. And that was kind of interesting too, because it was almost undoubtedly because he was afraid Stephen would defect. There had been, from when Stephen was a young child, friction between them, and Jones could be a scary, awful person sometime, even to his own family.
Now, again, just bringing up the story to date for our viewers and listeners, 918 people were killed all
Yes.
at once in Jonestown, Indiana. And then, November 18, 1978, started to hear it in the news, and we were all appalled as we saw these bodies laid across, and it was like, what? People took a while to wrap your head around understanding what was going on, and even to the present, I'm still, looking at it. But did you now, for the moment, saying, okay, once it happened, you said, oh, now I understand why this or that happened. But were you getting any indications that something was wrong when you had the kids in your room and you were discussing?
There were a couple of things in poems, looking back now, that one young man wrote in his poem. I was sitting alone, all alone. I was talking to myself, but I was afraid that someone might hear me. And I thought he was just being, joking about, people think I'm crazy if they see me here talking to myself. But it was very important never to say the wrong thing around other people in the church. We didn't know that. The kids didn't reveal that part of the church to us. We just knew they were, great kids. They helped Ron start a baseball team. He'd tried before, but couldn't get enough kids to come, and that were good athletes and would show up every time. And then the Temple kids, especially Tim, who really wanted to be a professional baseball pitcher, pitched in and convinced other kids to come, and they showed up. And there's a picture of the kind of is very illustrative of what the general community in San Francisco thought of the church at the time. Jim Jones was kind of a hero in the papers, who, because of the good works his people did by taking in foster children, by taking care of older people. He was a big animal lover, and they did a lot of good things for that. And political causes. There was a hotel called the International Hotel in San Francisco, and it was mostly occupied by elderly Filipino men who had come to the United States to work, and pretty much the other people in the hotel were their family. Well, the owners of the hotel decided they were going to kick all those people out and refurbish everything. And there were protests by the people in San Francisco, let them stay here. Don't make them go. This is their family. And it worked in the end. They did get to stay there, at least for a while. And Jim Jones and his son Tim, the one who wanted to be the baseball pitcher, there's a picture of them in the book at the I Hotel protest. But they did lots of good works, and the people loved doing the good works. When I heard about the church, when Jim Jones came to the school, I thought, that sounds like fun. They just have chairs instead of pews. Everybody gets up and dances to really good music, and they're singing, and it just seemed like a very joyous place. But Ron, there's a passage in the book, learns later when he goes with some of his students that there were also armed guards at the door. And there were armed guards in Jonestown around the people. Right. When they were brought out, it was Flavor Aid, a cheaper version of Kool-Aid, not Kool-Aid. So when people say that, it's one in error, two, and it's very cruel because he had the babies killed first, and the cyanide was shot down their throats. So if they
and and the mother's giving the cyanide to the children,
No,
to the
they
babies.
were brought up to, there was a table, and some of the mothers did and then took it themselves, but some of them, the people there killed the babies.
When I was going through the book, again, this happened in November 18th, 1978, 42 years ago. You know, I remember the pictures. And I don't know where I was at the time, but I just remember seeing it and reflecting on it, like what happened. But what happened when you saw it?
Same thing. It was all of San Francisco, the Bay Area, almost everybody here, that's the larger area around San Francisco, we call it the Bay Area, remembers exactly where they were when they heard the first news, because it was such a shock. And the first news really said 400 people died. But as more soldiers were sent in, more bodies counted, it ended up 918. And if you saw any of the pictures of the time, you might remember one with a young blonde man holding a scarf up to his face as he's pointing. And that was Tim Jones identifying the people he loved who had died in Jonestown. And they're more properly called murder-suicides, or some people even call it a massacre, which I wouldn't argue with, because he had the people convinced that their babies, their children, were going to be taken first, maybe tortured, maybe killed, that the Guyanese army, again, was going to come in and kill everyone, that nobody in the world cared about them. He pretended to call Russia to see if Russia would take them in, because a woman said, but wait, can't we do something? Isn't there someplace we have to go? Do we all have to die? And especially, we don't think the children should have to die. So he pretended to call Russia and then told them, nope, they don't want to have anything to do with you either. So that's the only thing we can do. And then he started to say, oh, well, we'll get on our little boat, which, would not hold 1,000 people. It was a tiny little boat, I think 32 feet long or something like that. It wasn't meant for the crossing the rough Atlantic Ocean there. He said, I'll go with you. But then a woman fell and broke her leg in the rush to try to get some of them onto the boat. And then he said, well, if she's not going, I'm not going either. He always found a way to play the hero's role, but often he was the instigator.
Judy, what did you personally feel? What did Judy feel?
At first, it was just such a huge shock that, we couldn't think what to think or what to do. And there was some hope because they were so young and full of spirit and strong and full of life. And the basketball team, which had been a lot of the same people on Ron's baseball team, did survive because they were in Georgetown, the capital. They had gone there earlier before the congressman visited, and the last night, the last white night, he used to call those nights, happened. But we thought some of them, they must be the ones who survived. They'd run out into the jungle. But all those on the cover of the book you're holding up are students who died there. And as I said, Ron and I recognized about 80 names on the who died list, which is another thing you can look at there. And those pictures are their passport photos that were taken away from them. We chose it because it looks kind of like a high school yearbook, but it's not.
Wonderful looking kids. I mean,
they were
just happy, smile, very content smiles, very content laughs. Where can our viewers and our listeners find the book?
It's on Amazon. You can look up And Then They Were Gone. It's on Kindle again, And Then They Were Gone. All bookstores can order it because Ingram, which distributes abroad as well as in the United States, carries it. So all the bookstore owners like that because they can order it, say they order 10 copies, only 8 sell. they just send the other two back to Ingram. And Ron and I like it because we don't have to pay for the printing. They do.
Ah, well, congratulations on writing it. We're
Also,
running. Go ahead.
I have a website, and it's judybebelaar.com. There's more about the book on the website. And I have a Facebook page, and Then They Were Gone has its own business page. So I try to keep up with news about the book on And Then They Were Gone, the Facebook page. So anyone can go to that. And it has won 10 honors and awards, the last just in September.
Yeah, the book just came out in 2018.
Well, usually a book is over after the first year, maybe two, that's it. And all my other books, by the way, are poetry. I'm in anthologies, and I have one poetry book of my own, but I'm in a lot of anthologies and magazines. But nobody...
That's why I saw it, but okay.
This is my nonfiction book, and it was a lot of work, but I am so glad that I did it. Ron and I did a lot of work on this book, but it's reaching people, and that's what I care about.
I could go all day on the book itself and the story, but unfortunately our time is short. So let me ask, in writing, analyzing, reviewing their stories, could you tell us what you extracted from their story that is applicable today and into the future for all of us?
Yeah, that's it's a complicated question and a really important question, because so often it is the young who are exploited and used by others for purposes that often aren't very good. It's the young often who die in wars, who are used as children soldiers in some country. So it's not something that is rare, unfortunately. It's something that happens a lot. It's just that so many people died at once in Jonestown that kind of makes it something people want to learn about. And I find out especially young people are interested in it once they learn how many young people were there and died, about the young people on the basketball team that lived because they were going to play basketball. They weren't going to come back like Jones told them to this white knight. He said, that's just that awful thing where they scare people. We're going to win the next game in the tournament. And then that ended up saving their lives. I'd like to, if it's okay with you, read a piece, because I think it will tell you something about the spirit of the kids. Do I have time for two pieces? Because I have one from the beginning of the book and then one from the end.
Sure.
Okay. This one is when Reverend Jones came to speak at Opportunity High School after the kids were in the school. And the two boys that you will meet there, Ronnie and Carl Ross, were brothers. And they really well represent the variety of kids that were in Opportunity. And these were not in the temple, these kids. Carl was a perfect student, there every day, on time, did all his work, and was in love with a temple girl, which was forbidden by Jones. So they were secret. I call them the Romeo and Juliet couples. And there were a couple of those young people that broke the rules out of love. Then Golden is our principal, and I'll talk about her ringing the bell, because like all of us, we wanted a different kind of school, none of those big buzzers. And so she went out with one of those little old-fashioned handbills. The chairs were set up in the first floor lobby used for gatherings. Many temple kids were sitting in the front rows with a few adults who were likely from the temple. Golden stood at the podium ringing her bell, the minister beside her with his dark glasses. And if you don't know, Jim Jones almost always had those dark glasses on, probably because of his own drug and alcohol consumption. Ronnie and Carl sat together near the middle of the audience. Bebelaar looked around for Stephen, Jim Jones' son. He was nowhere to be seen, though his brothers were sitting near the front. Golden cast a glance around the room that said, "Quiet down." The buzz of talk began to abate. She introduced the minister as a great man, a true revolutionary, someone they were fortunate to hear, and added that she expected perfect respect and behavior. "Now, please welcome the Reverend Jim Jones." The old students applauded politely, while those from the temple, students and adults, clapped enthusiastically and for a surprisingly long time. Although Jones quoted frequently from the Bible, he had a very modern take on the old stories. Eve had gotten a bad deal, having been blamed for death and sin in the world. Things hadn't changed much as far as he could tell. All the women and girls responded with applause. Jones talked about Christ as an agent for change, about how early Christians had to be courageous to follow their beliefs, how they lived communally, giving what they had to support the small group that lived together. He said he was a white minister of a mostly Black church because he could take his Black parishioners where they might not be able to go themselves. Golden beamed throughout the whole presentation and added her affirmations and responses loud and clear. When Jones finished his spirited talk, punctuated by appreciative laughter and occasional cheers from the audience, there was more applause, the loudest again from the temple members in the audience, though by now everyone clapped enthusiastically. Then Jones said he hoped to hear thoughts or questions from the young people in the room, and that old people and youngsters are our treasure. And Ronnie and Carl are going to be in this next paragraph. And Carl was a rule breaker. Carl didn't do all his work. Sometimes he was in juvenile detention. So they were very opposite, but both of them really charming, wonderful kids. And again, they're non-temple kids. Ronnie stood, and next to him, Carl did too, knowing that what Ronnie was about to say would get him in trouble again, and in this case, wanting to stand with him. Carl says, Ronnie says, "Reverend Jones, why don't you take your shades off?" Ronnie asked, in a tone somewhere between a demand and a question, "so I can see your eyes." The room became quiet. Ronnie removed his own dark glasses. There was an audible chorus of gasps. Ronnie was about to continue when Golden and the security guard headed through the crowd to stop him. They hustled Ronnie and Carl toward the principal's office as Golden scolded angrily. "How dare you? You've embarrassed us." To the minister, she said, "Please go ahead. I apologize for this terrible, disrespectful behavior." The minister seemed to smile, unperturbed. He did not take his glasses off. And that, I think, gives you the spirit of kids and that spirit of resistance. And we're going to speak up if we want to speak up. And that was true of the kids in Jonestown too. And that's why chapter 12 is my favorite chapter, because it's all about their resistance and the way they risked harsh punishments, hard labor, being locked up in the ECU, which was supposed to be like a hospital, but really it was where people were punished by giving them heavy drugs like Thorazine if they didn't do exactly as Jones wanted. So that's a little bit about opportunity and kind of gives you a taste of what our school was like. And then I'd like to, if there's time now, to read another.
We have very little time left. How long do we need?
Let's see. What would be the quickest way to do this? I guess explaining about the basketball team and then just reading a little bit of Stephen. the Stephen had a good, Jim Jones' only biological son, had a really good friend who also loved basketball as much as he did. And he convinced the father, just the way the kids, the sons in San Francisco, convinced the dad to allow the kids to go on the baseball team, because Jim Jones was totally against organized sport. But his wife, stood up for her sons, and they managed to get the baseball team through opportunity. And then in Jonestown, the kids and Marceline managed to talk Jones into letting the kids form a basketball team, which saved their lives. And this is from the book. We threw together a bootleg basketball court in Jonestown because I loved hoop, because Mike could weld, that was a friend of his, and because we both had just about enough of Dad's controlling shit. It was a juicy piece of rebellion that ultimately saved many young lives, because as I explained, that they were determined to be themselves, and they ended up being away in the capital of Georgetown in Guyana when the terrible event happened. I can't remember if Dad had said outright that we couldn't have a court. Everyone in town knew he didn't approve of competitive sport. It seemed like we were always trying to see how far we could get before our drug-whacked leader noticed. It was a lot harder for him to take something away than to snuff it while it was just between our ears. Once we got the idea, we didn't hesitate. It felt like we were erecting a monument to defiance. The court was birthed in rebellion, and even Dad knew that a larger rebellion lay in trying to stop what Mike and I had started. We were on that court just about every free minute we were given, and some that we took. Much steam was let off there, literally and figuratively. They even had a forbidden dance on the court because Jones was too whacked out, as Stephen puts it, to know what they were doing. And he had a loudspeaker, but they turned it off on him. So there were acts of rebellion there, and it was dangerous to rebel against him. I mean, punishments were horrible. Some people, didn't come back, and it was impossible to run away. They were so locked in by the jungle.
No, there was really no, they were on Devil's Island in its own right.
Right.
Really, when it comes
and he
to
had been
them.
convinced that the rest of the world hated them. That's why that the people would take their babies away and torture them, and then torture the people, and they were so exhausted and hungry and worked to death, made to stay up till all hours to listen to his harangues that weren't anymore the words of the minister. They were just harangues and how the world hated them and punishments. He would punish people up on the stage if they said, "I'd like to go home." That was awful.
I'm unfortunately, we're running out of time, but there's so many stories parallel with used during World War I, World War II to scare the families, to scare soldiers, to scare people that if you didn't sit up and defend yourself, all these horrible things were going to happen by the enemy. Some was basically true when you have the Russians invading Germany. Yeah. But, it just, so many of those stories keep ringing in the back of my head over and over again. It's unfortunate. But what I'm going to take away from more than just a history lesson of something extremely tragic is, like you said, the facility of abusing children, even to the present. It could be on a home level, doesn't have to be 900 people. It could be in a foster home. It could be in a domestic abuse environment. It's something. So it triggers the thought process that we have to think beyond just them, but how one person can manipulate or try to manipulate a family or much larger, and the terms that are used. and then be able to succeed in bringing about some horrible, horrible outcomes in the sense of murder and suicide,
Yeah,
etc. So
and once they were there, they were pretty much trapped.
yes, yeah,
A
well, like I
couple
said,
of people
yeah,
did try to run away, and a couple of them made it, but you risked your life to do that.
like I said, it's Devil's Island all over again in Papillon,
Yeah.
and the story comes up. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. I'm Armando F. Sanchez. It's been a pleasure and my honor to be interviewing Judy Bebelaar on this wonderful book. And then they were gone. Teenagers of People's Temple from high school to Jonestown. Please, in the few seconds that we have left, we're going to give out her contact information again. Judy, one more time, how can persons find the book and get in contact with you?
You can look up my website. It's judybebelaar.com. You can look up the book's website, and then they were gone, and anyone can go to that. It's a public website. The book is on Amazon. It's also on Kindle now. So if you want to listen to the book, it's on Kindle, and then they were gone. And you can ask your local bookstore to order it because it's on Ingram, which is a big worldwide distributor of books. And I hope you do read it and get to know these kids better. They were wonderful kids. Their poetry is in the book. More stories about their resistance and rebellion in my favorite chapter, chapter 12. And you learn the sadness of it, and hopefully we can learn how to prevent this in the future. Kids need mentors, good mentors. So if you know of a kid that's having a rough time, try to give that kid some help. Give them somebody to talk to. And that's one way you can help. Pay attention to what's happening to kids. If they look exhausted and tired, or they don't seem to want to talk about certain things, reach out to them and do what you can to reach out to kids, because they are so vulnerable. They have been so often used and abused. And now, if you suspect something, you can report it, at least in the United States. I know you can. And it doesn't get results always, but it's worth a try to save a kid's life. And at least the kid will know somebody is on his or her side. Now it's illegal not to report it if you know that a kid is suffering abuse. So it's important to do that. But more important, just to give the kid somebody to talk to, somebody to trust if he's in a situation that's not safe.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you for being on our program. I'm Armando F. Sanchez. You can contact me regarding contacting Judy, but she gave us also her sites where you can find her. Or you have any questions, please contact me at afsanchez66@gmail.com. Judy, I wish you continuous success. Thank you for writing this outstanding book and all the other works you do. I know you also wrote some poetry in the area also of the COVID deaths as well. So I had the honor and the pleasure of hearing those as well. I look forward to having you into future programs, but thank you very much for being on our program.
Thank you so much, Armando. I really appreciate it, because I want the world to know these wonderful kids, and hopefully to look for signs that other kids are caught in a situation which is very hard to escape.
Thank
you. They need us.